In 1984 in East Berlin, the population of the GDR is kept under strict control by the Stasi, the East German secret police. Its forces of 100,000 employees and 200,000 informers safeguard the dictatorship of the proletariat, whose declared goal was to know everything. In a temporary detention center of the Ministry for State Security, prisoner 227 is brought in front of Captain Gerd Wiesler to be asked a series of questions. After a bit of back and forth, the captain reminds the prisoner that on September 28th, Dieter Primizens, the prisoner's friend and neighbor, fled to the west, and Gerd tells him that they believe he was helped by somebody. Prisoner 227 is adamant about not knowing anything, and the captain asks him to recount his statement, the process of which would continue for 40 hours until the prisoner breaks and gives them the name Werner Glaske. Days later after the interrogation, Gerd presents the recording of the tape to the class that he teaches, step by step showing them his interrogation tactics. After the class, his friend and superior, Lieutenant Colonel Anton, comes into his class as his students leave and tells them that he wants to invite him to the theater. He tells them that things would start at 7 p.m. so they get going. At the theater, after watching the first half of the play, Gerd tells Anton that he should have the writers monitored, to which Anton responds by saying that the writer was clean. Anton goes downstairs to speak to the Minister of Culture, Bruno, who asks what he thought about the playwright, George. Sensing that there was something, he follows Gerd's instincts and tells him that he thinks he might not be as clean after all, which the minister applauds him for. Bruno orders Anton to find out what he can about George, and after the play was over, some special guests, including Anton and Gerd, are invited to George's house for an after party. Minister Bruno gives a heartwarming speech about how George was an engineer of the soul and is then applauded. Afterward, George requests to have his blacklisted director returned, but Bruno will not hear of it. After the party, while Anton was driving Gerd home, he explains that his team would be ready to wire George's place by tomorrow and that it would need to be finished by Thursday. He then asks Gerd to go about it carefully before he leaves the car and goes home. In the next few days, Gerd and his team bug George's apartment and set up surveillance equipment in the attic and all around the house. On his way out, Gerd realizes George's neighbor had been watching through her peephole and threatens her daughter's place in the university if she says anything about this to anyone. George goes to visit his blacklisted director and friend Albert, and he lets Albert know that he was missed at the premiere of his play. A depressed Albert tells his friend that he could not bear the arrogant people that come to watch plays anymore, and that perhaps in the next life they'll just be happy being an author. Trying to lift his friend's spirit, George mentions that he'd spoken to the minister that night of the premiere, and then lies about there being concrete hope that Albert would return to his directing job. When he returns home, he finds his actress girlfriend Christa-Maria decorating the house for his birthday celebration. During the party, George sees his friend Albert sitting alone and goes over to speak to him, and Albert hands him something inside a khaki paper and solemnly tells him that he feels like a fraud amongst his guests. George is surprised by his wording and assures him that everyone admires him, and suddenly a ruckus erupts and George sees that his friend Paul is harassing the director Egon by saying that he was a Stasi. George takes Paul inside and asks him to stop making a scene, and upset, Paul tells the playwright that he needs to pick a side and that he cannot continue living in the middle before leaving the party. After the party, George starts opening gifts and finds Albert's present, which was a sheet music called Sonnet for a Good Man. The next day, while Gerd and Anton were having lunch, Anton informs him that the car that dropped off George's girlfriend Christa was Minister Bruno's car. He explains that they can't monitor top officials, so he had to remove the entry Gerd had made in his report and orders him to make reports orally moving forward. That night, on her way home, Christa is stopped by the minister's car and is asked to get inside. Inside, Bruno forces her to sleep with him by mentioning the protection that he's been giving her, and Gerd was surveying the building through a camera that he set up in a small office across the street, and when he sees the minister's car approaching the building, Gerd automatically rings the bell from his office so that George could catch his girlfriend red-handed. George goes downstairs and sees Christa come out of Bruno's car with her wardrobe all disheveled. Devastated by the sight, George hides until she gets into the building and makes her way to the apartment. Christa bawls her eyes out in the shower, ashamed of what she had done. Wait, hold on. Did you subscribe to our channel? Come on guys, you're here, you're watching the video. Help us out by hitting the subscribe button, as it really helps out me and my team to make more videos for you guys. And now, let's get back to the recap. The next morning, George receives a phone call from his friend Wallner informing him that Albert was found in his house dead after hanging himself. Saddened by the news, he takes out the music sheet that Albert had given him and starts playing. As he hears George play the music, a single teardrop runs down Gerd's face. That night, as Christina lies about meeting an old friend and tries to leave. George confronts her about what she's doing with the minister and asks her not to go. Although he tries to assure her that she doesn't need the man, she tells him that these men have all the power, and if Minister Bruno wanted it, he could blacklist her from acting. And she tells him that neither one of them want to end up like Albert. After Christa leaves the house, Gerd follows her to a bar, and posing as a fan, he encourages her to be true to herself, and after her conversation with Gerd, Christa returns home, and after promising that she would never leave again, she reconciles with George. After his friend's funeral, George decides to write an article that emphasizes on all the people who take their lives in the country, and as they take a stroll in the park, he shows it to his friend Paul and asks for his help to publish it, and Paul was more than happy to help. Although George is sure that his house is not bugged, Paul has his suspicions and devises a plan to find out. At George's house, Paul collaborates with his uncle to make it seem like he was being carried out of the border in the truck of his uncle's car. Gerd, hearing this, feels obligated to report, but changes his mind at the last minute. After hearing back from Paul's uncle that there hadn't been any checks, George and his friend Carl are convinced that they're safe at George's house, and they start insulting the government. They plot to work together under the pretense that they were writing a new play, and Gerd makes a note that nothing significant is happening. The next day, an editor of Der Spiegel smuggles George an ultra-flat typewriter with a red ribbon after explaining his article should only be written with this one so that the Stasi don't trace it back to him. The three men toast to exposing the GDR, which forces Gerd to write a proper report to expose the conspirators. In Anton's office, Gerd finds out that he plans to put George in complete isolation in prison, releasing him in 10 months when he won't cause any trouble. When hearing this, Gerd decides not to present his report, but instead suggests that they slim down the operation because it was such an uncertain case. Anton suspects that Gerd is hiding something, but tells him to continue on the case. After typing out his article, George hides his typewriter under the floorboard, but is seen by Christa, who was just coming in. He tries to explain what she had seen, but she assures him that she doesn't need to know and that she supports him, and a few days later, the article is published, creating an uproar from the government. The Stasi obtain a copy, but are unable to link it to any registered typewriter. Later, Anton and Minister Bruno have a meeting in his car, and angry about being rejected by Christa, Bruno gives Anton the information about where she gets her illegal medication, and orders him to prevent her from performing on any German stage ever again. Christa is caught and taken to be interrogated, and she is then blackmailed into revealing George as the author of the article. The Stasi police immediately head to George's apartment, and after informing him of the warrant, they start searching the place, and after searching thoroughly, the men inform Anton that there was nothing inside the apartment. Witnessing the raid, Gerd is relieved that the officer didn't find anything, and Anton, suspicious that he had mentioned nothing unusual in his daily reports of the monitoring, has him do follow-up interrogations on Christa after warning him not to screw things up again. Once the prisoner was brought to him, Gerd tells her that in 10 hours, she'll be pulled out of the play that she had been working on so hard, and that it would be the last time her name would ever be mentioned in the acting world. Scared for her career, Christa reveals the exact hiding place of the typewriter. When she reveals the information, she's released from captivity, but fearing for George's safety, Gerd hurries to his house and removes the typewriter from the floorboard. And Christa goes home and tells George that she spent the night at a friend's house. A few minutes after her arrival, Anton and the Stasi return to George's apartment with the claim that they might not have done their job thoroughly enough. After pretending to look around, Anton opens the floorboard where he is sure that the typewriter would be, and George looks at Christa and realizes that she betrayed him. But when Anton removes the floorboard, the typewriter was nowhere to be found. Unaware of this, Christa had run out to the street in despair and right into the path of a truck. Hearing the loud bang, George looks out the window and sees Christa on the ground. He hurries downstairs and holds her in his arm, asking her to forgive him. But Christa dies as he was holding her in his arms. Finding nothing in the apartment and his only witness dead, Anton shuts down the mission and in private informs Gerd that his career was now over for failing this mission and that his remaining years with the Stasi will be in Department M, a dead-end assignment for disgraced agents. 4 years and 7 months later, Gerd is team opening letters with a coworker when they hear the fall of the Berlin Wall on the radio. The man gives him his earphones, letting him hear the news for himself, and realizing what this means, Wiesler silently gets up and leaves the office, inspiring his coworkers to do the same. 2 years later, George presents the old play Christa used to star in. Overwhelmed with the memories, he hurries out and runs into former minister Bruno. George asks the former minister why he was never monitored when everybody else was, was, and Bruno tells him that he had been under full surveillance in 1984 and that they knew everything. Being spiteful, the man also tells George that he knew that he couldn't give Christa what she needed, and George chastises the former minister and tells him that it was sad that people like him were allowed to rule the country. Surprised by the information that he was given, George goes home and searches his apartment, where he finds the now abandoned listening devices and rips them off the wall. He then goes to the Stasi records agency and reviews the files kept while he was under surveillance, and after thoroughly going through every report, he finds out that Christa had betrayed him to the Stasi and that she'd also been released just before the second search and wouldn't have been able to remove the typewriter as he assumed. As he goes through the file, he is confused by a large amount of contradictory information, but as he reaches the final report and sees the fingerprint in red ink, he realizes that the officer in charge of his surveillance had concealed his activities, including his authorship of the article, and also removed the typewriter from his apartment. George tracks down Gerd, who was now working as a delivery man. He was unsure on how to approach him, but thanks him and George decides to walk away. 2 years later, Gerd passes a bookstore window display promoting George's new novel, Sonnet von Guten Menschen, and goes to take a look at it. On the second page of the book, he finds a dedication to HGWXX-7, which used to be his code name while he was an agent. Pleasantly surprised, Gerd decides to buy the book, and when the cashier asks if he wants it gift wrapped, he refuses, telling him that it's for him. And that is how the movie comes to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed this recap. Make sure to leave me a like, leave a comment, also subscribe to my channel. I love you guys so much, and I promise to see you on my next recap. Bye!